How are chief rabbis elected in Israel? And what happens when a chief rabbi runs for office and then loses? How should a chief rabbi react if a woman wants to shake his hand? And what happens if he is personally insulted by a younger student who says he's not religious enough? We'll find out in this special interview with Dr. Alan Unterman, the nephew of the late Chief Rabbi Isser Yehuda Unterman, who served as Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi of the State of Israel from 1964 to 1972. This interview came about when I bumped into Yael Unterman, a young educator who does something here in Jerusalem called bibliodrama. I told her I had been flipping through the Encyclopedia Judaica when I came across the entry for Chief Rabbi Unterman, and she said, "That's my great-uncle." So I said, "Well, you have to come on my podcast." And she replied, "Well, I never actually knew him. You should interview my father," who not only knew the Chief Rabbi personally, but also happened to work on Encyclopedia Judaica. So here we are with Dr. Alan Unterman. Dr. Unterman, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, how are you related to the former Chief Rabbi, and how well did you know him?
The former Chief Rabbi was my father's older brother, and I knew him towards the end of his life. I didn't know, obviously, him when he was younger, but I know of him and some of his exploits. I spent some time with him in his latter years.
Was he an inspirational person, filled with knowledge?
He was certainly filled with knowledge. He tried not to be inspirational in the sense that he was very modest in his own behavior. That was his Mussar tradition from the old school, not bragging about things, but he was a very interesting person to be with, to talk to discuss things with, and that's what we did. We used to go for walks together. He had a practice of going for walks outside the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, because after a day of sitting and meetings and arguing and discussing things, he liked to get out into the air where there was nobody there because the guard at the Knesset let him in privately. We used to drive in and then walk up and down, and he knew that people wouldn't come up to him with their problems. He could just, chat and have the night air and get some exercise. And that's what we used to do quite often.
And so you grew up in Israel, or are you British, or were you back and forth?
No, I grew up in Britain, but I lived in Israel over the last 50-odd years, on and off. I wasn't here all the time. I lived in Britain, I lived in Australia, but I also lived in Jerusalem, which is where I am now.
Now, you mentioned old school, and I read an article that Rabbi Unterman was considered by some the last of the old-style European rabbis. Is that also how you would describe him?
I wouldn't say the last, but certainly he grew up in Lithuania. He studied there. He actually was a rabbi of various towns there. Before he came to England, he came to Liverpool, which is a town in the north of England, in 1923 as the communal rabbi. So he had some experience of British culture as well as of the old-fashioned Lithuanian yeshiva culture. And that made him a more rounded person, I think. But yes, his formative years were certainly of the old school.
And what were the controversial issues of the day? What does a chief rabbi have to deal with?
Almost every issue could be controversial. Certainly coming to Israel, he came before independence. He came in 1947 as the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. And of course, the new state had all kinds of problems because there hadn't been a Jewish state trying to deal with Judaism and ordinary people and politics for a couple of thousand years, since perhaps the Hasmonean period or the Herodian period. He and many of the other Zionistically inclined rabbis had to face these problems and deal with them. Problems of who is a Jew, problems of whether the state should try to implement Jewish law or let people do their own thing, and so on. He was involved in a lot of these issues. Some of them he was criticized for because he tried to find solutions which were not acceptable to everybody, but others in which, yes, he did manage to find his way through and deal with issues. It was Russian Jewish immigration. Not all the Russian Jews, as you know, were actually of halakhic Jewish descent, and they had to be dealt with.
I guess that's something for chief rabbis over the years, and I understand you also met Chief Rabbi Herzog.
Personally, I didn't, but my late father was very close to Chief Rabbi Herzog in the days before he became Chief Rabbi, when he was the Chief Rabbi of Ireland. My father lived in Dublin. He was very close to him in those days. And so I heard lots of stories about him, but no, I didn't actually know him personally. My father actually in Dublin taught Rabbi Herzog's sons Talmud. Then they were obviously quite talented, and they played a big role in the new state eventually, particularly Yaakov Herzog, but also Yitzchak.
I asked you before the interview about the first chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Kook, and you corrected me that Rabbi Kook is not actually the first chief rabbi.
That's correct. Yes, he was certainly an Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the Holy Land, of what was then Palestine, but he died well before the foundation of the state. So Rabbi Herzog was the actual first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the new state of Israel. But Rabbi Kook really was very influential in the whole of religious culture in the state. Again, a controversial figure. He was opposed by some, but he left a heritage in his writings and in his personality, which we still have today and which we are still, as it were, making sense of.
And Rabbi Unterman followed in those footsteps?
Yes, I mean, it was impossible for anybody to follow in the footsteps of Rabbi Kook because he was a one-off. But certainly the chief rabbis after him certainly took account of what he'd done and what he'd started. And he started the whole Ashkenazi chief rabbinate because that was pre-state, but still it continued after the state was born. Unfortunately, I don't know whether my late uncle actually met Rabbi Kook. I never asked him that question. I regret it. I know that he came out to Palestine when he was the rabbi of Liverpool. He came out to Palestine in 1925 because his father, my grandfather, had actually made Aliyah from Lithuania, and he came to visit him. But I never really asked him any questions about who he met when he was here. So I have nothing to say about that. I mean, I know he respected Rabbi Kook, but I don't know whether he actually ever spent any time with him.
And can you give us some insight on other things the chief rabbi in general back then and today is responsible for? I mean, how are they elected?
To some extent, of course, it's politics, how anybody's elected in Israel. I know in the days that my uncle was elected, he was involved in what was known as the Mizrahi Party. When he was in England, he was an active chairman of the Mizrahi, which were the religious Zionist Party. And certainly for the beginning of the state, the chief rabbis were Zionists. That hasn't continued to some extent. We can't be sure today, certainly not about the Sephardi chief rabbi, as to whether they are Zionists or not. It's a religious role, but the attitude of the chief rabbi towards the state of Israel is something which has not been firmly embedded in rock. The early chief rabbis certainly were. My late uncle was a Zionist. He believed in the foundation of the state. He believed in the work going towards a Jewish state, however much Judaism was implemented. That was the original kind of idea, but I'm not sure today if it's still so important. It should be, because after all, the chief rabbi of the state of Israel, but we have had some candidates who became chief rabbi who were not particularly Zionistically inclined.
And it's a position for 10 years.
This is something they introduced. Originally, it wasn't. Originally, it was simply a position you held, and then there were elections every so many years, and you either got in or didn't. Occasionally, you didn't. My late uncle actually was defeated. He stood for a second term. He was defeated by Rabbi Goren, and although people said, it wasn't a nice thing, if he'd been the chief rabbi, he should be allowed to run for a second term. But as we know from American politics, not every president is allowed to run for a second term, and he was defeated. But then introduced this idea that it was a one-off thing for 10 years, and you couldn't run for a second time. So they didn't have the problem of a chief rabbi trying to run a second time and not getting the position, which did happen to my uncle.
And what about Encyclopedia Judaica? You have a connection with that?
Yeah, I worked on the Encyclopedia Judaica for several years. This was in the early 70s when they were just producing it. It was coming out. In fact, I met my wife there in the Encyclopedia Judaica. I can't remember which page we were on when I met her, but we got married in Jerusalem.
I think that's interesting because I found the entry for Rabbi Unterman in the Encyclopedia Judaica, and lo and behold, you were affiliated with it.
Indeed, yes.
And you're the author of several books.
Yes, various books, but mostly on Jewish subjects of one kind or another. My main interest was in comparative religion, in Judaism and also in Hindu religion, Indian religion. I did my PhD in India in the 60s.
Any other stories you want to share about your uncle or some insights?
His favorite teacher was a Rabbi Shimon Shkop, who was a great Lithuanian rabbi, Rosh Yeshiva in Lithuania. Now, there's a story about my uncle. One time, he was standing with a group of rabbis, and an American tourist woman came up to him and said, "Oh, Rabbi Unterman," and she put out her hand to shake his hand. Now, it wasn't the done thing, of course, for a rabbi to shake the hand of a woman, but he responded by putting his hand out and shook her hand and said hello and so on. And when she'd gone, he said to the other rabbis, "You must understand that I'm not being flippant about my contact with women who are not my wife, but I didn't want to put her to shame. She'd stuck her hand out, so I shook her hand." And of course, he was criticized for this because the other rabbis were a little bit shocked. The same story is told about his own teacher, Rabbi Shimon Shkop in Lithuania, whose granddaughter became a Marxist. And she was staying with him. Her parents had died. And she had a friend came to visit her. And the friend saw this old rabbi, and she also stuck out her hand to say hello. And he shook her hand. When she'd gone, the daughter said to him, "You know, that was a bit remarkable." He said, "Look, you mustn't put a person to shame in public." And that's why I shook her hand. There was such a tradition of trying to behave in public, at least to respect other people, even though what you did may not have been 100% how you normally behave. But that was my uncle. I think he took the view that people were very important and how you respected them was very important as a major part of Judaism itself. He wrote an article saying that the practice, what is called in Hebrew, darkei shalom, seeking harmony with people, is an essential part of Jewish life. And it's as important as the commandments about what you eat, what you can't eat, and so on, how you behave to others. Anyway, he believed that, and he wrote this article. There's another story which illustrates this. One time, there was a young yeshiva bacher. He was getting married. And this yeshiva bacher was getting married to the daughter of one of the dayanim of Tel Aviv. This was the old days when my uncle was the Chief Rabbi of Tel Aviv. Now, this young yeshiva bacher was a bit more of a right-wing type who had studied with a famous rabbi called the Chazon Ish, who lived in Bnei Brak. And the Chazon Ish, according to this yeshiva bacher, had said that Zionists, the wine of Zionists, should not be drunk because it's what's called yayin nesech. So the yeshiva bacher had a problem. He was being married by a Zionist chief rabbi to the daughter of a Zionist dayan. So what he did was he boiled the wine, because the idea that boiled wine doesn't come under this restriction, yayin mevushal. Anyway, when my uncle came to the ceremony, the wine was still warm, having been recently boiled by this yeshiva bacher. So what he did was he made a joke by saying, "I see that you've boiled the wine. Now, the reason why the rabbis forbade the wine of Gentiles or of non-religious Jews was that you shouldn't come to marry their daughters. I see you don't mind marrying the dayan's daughter, but you don't trust the wine of the rabbis who are running the ceremony." And there is a follow-up to this story. This young yeshiva bacher eventually became a Rosh Yeshiva in Ashkelon, I think it was, Karellenstein. Anyway, one time I said to my uncle, I didn't know this story originally, and I said to my uncle, "I'm going to spend Shabbos with Karellenstein." And he thought I was talking about this Rosh Yeshiva. Actually, I was going to spend the Shabbos with the Rosh Yeshiva's brother. And he said, oh, yes, he's a very fine Rosh Yeshiva. That means he didn't hold it against him that he'd gone through this. It was a little bit of an insult, I suppose, to boil the wine when you're being married by the chief rabbi, but he let it go. And he was like that. He didn't bear grudges against people. He let them go because that was it. This was the Musa way, the old-fashioned way. Okay, it happened. He made a joke of it, and that was it. That was the kind of personality. I was quite taken by that aspect of his personality. He was willing to get on with all kinds of people. He was very respectful of Lubavitch, for instance. I heard him once give a sermon when he praised Lubavitch for standing up in the Stalinist era, in Soviet era, and trying to maintain their Yiddishkeit, their Judaism, despite the pressure they were under. And so he was willing to see the good in people as a chief rabbi. I mean, it was hard. He was criticized by people on the right who thought that he was too easygoing, too liberal in his attitude towards people, but that was him.
Those are good stories. I would like to ask one final question. I'm looking at some historic photos of Rabbi Unterman, and I can't help noticing he's wearing what appears to be a top hat. Is that like a chief rabbi thing of the day?
Not exactly a chief rabbi. If you look at some of the pictures of some of the great rabbis from the 19th and early 20th century in Eastern Europe, they wore top hats. Even in America, some of the Eastern European rabbis who emigrated to America continued to wear, this was a kind of a rabbinical garb. He used to wear a top hat in the old days, and so he carried on. Rabbi Herzog wore a top hat. Rabbi Unterman wore a top hat. It's now a dead custom. I mean, I don't imagine a modern Israeli chief rabbi wearing a top hat, but this used to be the practice. Where it started, I'm not sure. It is a bit odd, I must admit, but that was what they did. And if you go into the pictures of not just of chief rabbis, of some of the great rabbis of the past in Eastern Europe, they're wearing top hats. Just as Hasidic rabbis used to wear woolen or animal skin streimels, this was the kind of rabbinical dress of the old days.
Dr. Alan Unterman, I appreciate you taking the time to share some of your stories and insights with us. Any final words you want to share?
The only thing I would say is it's possible that another generation will find in the current chief rabbis things to admire and so on. But it's nice to look back, and I'm very glad that I had those years together with him and was able to discuss things with him and see how he worked. I hope that they are an exemplar to us of how to behave, how to be a rabbi, loyal to the Torah and to the halakha, but yet to be a fine person, a mensch. And that's what I can say of my late uncle. Primarily, he was a mensch, and then he was a rabbi. And in that order, I think all of us need to learn a lesson about how to behave. Thank you for interviewing me. God bless.
Thank you. You too. Any insight on your daughter's bibliodrama? She's kind of the next generation.
Absolutely. And I'm very proud of her. I mean, it's not my cup of tea, and I couldn't do it even if I tried. But she has taken to it. She finds it's a way of getting people to actually look at the Bible in a new way and understand the character and the stories and the message. And it seems to work. People do appreciate it. That's her decision. I mean, I must admit, I do not understand a lot of the things of the younger generation, but I've seen her perform, and it's fantastic. So good luck to her.
Thank you to Dr. Alan Unterman, author of The Kabbalistic Tradition, the Dictionary of Jewish Lore and Legend, Jews and Their Religious Beliefs and Practices, and Wisdom of the Jewish Mystics. This has been a moment in Jewish history. My name is Ben Bresky, and for questions or comments and past shows, you can visit benbresky.substack.com. Thank you to all the listeners, and Shalom.